Thank you and good morning. I guess it's still morning. First, before I say anything about Donald Trump, I want to, on the record, say, and I'm sure it's been said, how all of us should be in prayer for those in Israel that have faced this debauchery, as we also can identify with fighting for what is right. You have to fight, and I've learned that over my life, you have to fight for what's right in the right way. And for those that identify with whatever is going on in the Middle East, and I believe there ought to be a two-state solution. Killing children and elderly is not the way. And I think that we all should unite around that. Donald Trump is something beyond politics. I head National Action Network. We don't endorse candidates, but we fight against those things that are wrong in the political and social setting. Donald Trump, in order to understand how he got to the White House, you must understand New York politics and the environment of New York. Donald Trump was born in Queens, and his father was a well-to-do landlord. They had been sued for discrimination in their apartment buildings. And Donald Trump grew up looking up to people like Roy Cohn, who was a lawyer for the mob. He was an out-of-borough guy who always felt that he and his father was looked down on because they were not part of the Manhattan Park Avenue crowd. And he was totally one that would go and deal with anyone on any level from an opportunistic point of view. So if Republicans were in, he was a Republican to get his developments. If Democrats were in, Democrats, he'd come to some of our stuff. Donald Trump, I met after marching on him around the discrimination cases, and then he would try to be Democrat when Dinkins was in, and then he would try and associate with us. He got Don King to bring him around, and if Donald Trump had been born black, he'd have been Don King. But as time went on, the only social, political, social justice issue that we ever saw Donald Trump involved in was when he took out ads in New York papers calling for the death penalty of 5 young black and brown men who had been falsely accused of raping a white female in Central Park. And he called for the death penalty. And he put newspaper ads in all 4 papers at that time. It was one of the few bills he paid for. Now, you've got to know the climate. We had everything from the Bernard Goetz case to the Howard Beach case all the way up. He never opened his mouth other than to play the race card on the Central Park 5. To understand then Trump, you understand the resentment that the so-called Park Avenue real estate elite didn't embrace him, and he played on the resentment of the Central Park 5. That created the politic that Donald Trump brought to America in 2016 to win the presidency, because it baffled many people. Why would people that were blue-collar conservatives be persuaded by this self-announced billionaire? And we're finding out from the civil case even that was a lie. Because he played into their resentment. He played into, you're not like the guys that I had to fight in New York. He knew that chip on the shoulder as an Attleboro guy. And he also knew how to play the race card. And he played the misogyny card, homophobic card. He played all of that, which created enough for him to get to the White House. Now, the challenge we have is that he therefore, because Donald Trump doesn't believe anything but Donald Trump, so you are not fighting a philosophical fight or an ideological fight, because Donald Trump would be, if he was in this building, he'd come in here and say that we're all together, right? And you love me, right? I mean, that's how he lived. But he played on it so that he was able to become a symbol for all of the things that were gained in the last 60 years in this country. So the way to deal with ridding ourselves of Trump and what he represents is not about a party or not about a candidate. It's to understand that this man represents the end of women's right to choose, the end of voting rights, the end of civil rights for black and browns, the end of what we have gained in terms of LGBTQ civil rights advancement. We are fighting against one that has symbolized and done everything he can to eradicate all of that, which means that unless we in a real way get beyond our differences, our grudges, our whatever, who shot John, who said something 20 years ago against us, if we cannot unite those constituencies, we will end up with Donald Trump again dividing and conquer this country. It will take a real energized coalition because they are trying to make people address things other than their own self-interest. I do a radio show 5 days a week, 3 hours a day. It's a call-in show. And I have people call me from all over the country, many of them in the black community. And they say, well, I don't want to vote. I don't see nobody talking about whatever their issue is. And I said to a caller the other day, I said, you call me all the time, you don't believe in voting, we have this argument. I said, you didn't vote in 16, did you? No, I didn't see the difference. I said, well, let me ask you something. Do you see the difference now? Your child cannot deal with things that you could deal with because you didn't vote. I have one grandchild. My grandson will be 5 years old in December. If we don't turn this country around, he will grow up with less rights than his mother did. When my daughter, his mother, was growing up, women had the right to choose. Voting rights was protected. Immigration rights was at least on the table. We had made progress in LGBTQ rights. All of that will be gone by the time he's a teenager. And everybody that didn't vote in 16 voted for putting 3 conservative judges on the Supreme Court. They voted for 200 federal judges that are now enforcing that affirmative action is dead. This is not about personality politics. This is about the America that we all fought for and began to change that has now gone backwards. And if we cannot get past our own differences, our own pettiness, our own grudges, some of them legitimate, but they're not more important than what we stand for. And at the end of the day, the challenge for this generation, young and old, is what we stand for, because the America that we grew up in is not the America of today. Trump did what they wanted him to do. He stacked the courts. He did what they wanted him to do. He cut those situations in terms of voting gerrymandering that you can have 8 far-right fringe Republicans flip the whole House of Representatives into turmoil on the selection of a speaker? Can you imagine that they can't even meet on aid to Ukraine or Israel because they don't have a Speaker of the House? I mean, this is stuff when I was coming through elementary and junior high school wouldn't even been imagined. They are literally sitting up there being held kidnapped by 8 people that would have shamed William Buckley as a conservative. So what we're talking about is deeper than who's gonna run or is Joe Biden too old. I mean, if they dictate the discussion, if they set the premise, then we will come to their conclusion. The premise must be, what kind of America do we want? The premise could be, do we protect the gains that was made and go further? The premise must be set, but we don't want to discuss things that don't matter. Why are we arguing about whether an 80-year-old man is older than a 77-year-old man? That is a foolish argument. The arguments, while we arguing that and while they're playing, you know, I come out of Brooklyn, and they used to have people downtown on Fulton Street that played the 3-card Monte. And the game was that they'd have 3 cards, and they'd tell you, guess which card there's a $20 bill on, and they'd play the game, and you'd always guess the wrong card. Well, that's what they're playing, political 3-card Monte. Is Biden too old? Can Kamala make it? And this one rise? Wait a minute, that ain't the game we playing. We're talking about our rights. We're talking about women's right to choose over their bodies. We're talking about how you're having courts cut up districts where blacks are being disempowered and Latinos. We're talking about police reform. We're talking about basic things that were solved and settled in law that has now been flipped over because Trump stacked the courts and Trump was able to do what he did in the Supreme Court. He was the entertainer. He was the performance. Those that wanted to carve the country up had been doing this for several decades, and they finally found an Elvis that could get the show on the road. Trump was Elvis. We have to defeat Colonel Parker. So all of the things that they will tell us about why we shouldn't be together, we must fight. And all of us come with things that we could say that we should not say and do, all of that notwithstanding. None of us will be where we need to be unless all of us are on the same page of where this country needs to go. They find a way to come together. Look at just the last election. Donald Trump belittled and shamed and embarrassed everybody in the Republican primaries that ran against him. And every one of them got in the Senate and in the House and praised him and voted the way he wanted. They found a way. I mean, look at the stuff he said about Ted Cruz and talking about people's wives and daddies and everything else. But Cruz stood right there because Trump represented what they wanted done. They cannot be smarter than those of us that call ourselves progressive or those of us that call ourselves sane. We cannot be so immature that they can get over things and unite to bring us back, that we can't get over things to unite to bring us together and forward. So that's why I wanted to be here today to give my few observations. I know Michael Tomasky invited me for a long time. He's written critical things about me. Sometimes he was right. Don't tell him I said so. I tell him he was wrong. But it's not about how we grew up. It's about where we are now. And it's about I don't want to one day have to explain to my grandson why I grew up in an America that was more inclined with his rights than he had. Not on my watch and not on your watch should we let America go backwards. This should not be in recorded history 100 years from now, that we were too immature and too self-indulgent to save this country. These people are serious. They have dismantled what this country had matured to stand for. We had not got everywhere that we wanted, but we were on our way. We cannot let them turn this clock back, and we cannot be the ones in history that fumbled the ball. Can you imagine that we went from the rise of Barry Goldwater in '64, defeated him with Johnson, from Johnson defeated. When did Johnson get defeated? I was a young going to high school, '68. Johnson withdrew, wouldn't run because of the war in Vietnam, and all of us were marching and protesting the war. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, ran against a guy called Richard Nixon. Nixon had lost to John Kennedy 8 years before that in '60. Went home to California in '62 and lost for governor of California. But because in '68, I watched this as a kid. I was 13, had just joined Operation Breadbasket here in New York. I was Jesse Jackson's youth director. And because we started fighting the peace activists against the hippies, and the hippies against the LSD crowd, and the Black Panthers against the Black nationalists, and SDS, in the splits, a defeated presidential candidate and defeated governor came through and became president of the United States, Richard Nixon. Their plan is we played them against each other, and they beat themselves. Years later, I was very friendly with Muhammad Ali, and Ali told me the way he was able to regain the title from a younger, stronger George Foreman is he knew he couldn't dance like he used to in the boxing ring. He knew he didn't have the snap in his punch like he used to. He laid on the ropes and formed a boxing strategy, rope-a-dope. And he let Foreman punch himself out, and when Foreman, before he can get his second win, he says he's tired now, and he knocked him out. Don't let them rope-a-dope us to where we are arguing about who's the most radical and who's the most progressive and who did this and who did that. That's rope-a-dope. You're wasting energy on the wrong enemies. We must have our legitimate debates, have our disagreements, but then come in the ring and fight the people that are against all of us. People say to me in the churches, Reverend, I don't know why you're so strong about LGBTQ. Because in our communities, we must come together. My sister is gay. She doesn't wake up one morning gay and the other morning black. She's black and gay at the same time. So let's stop acting like we're more divided than we are. And let's stop laying on the ropes getting beaten. They're not smarter than us. They're not stronger than us. They don't have more energy than us. We just have to have the right strategy of unity, and we can turn this country around. I got a young man named Corey Weiss, and I called him and told him to meet me uptown at NAN's headquarters. And I wanted him to see that if we put the right systems in place and the right people in office. I wanted him to see that many years before, he was one of those 5 young men that had been wrongly accused of the Central Park jogger rape. And he was brought down and handcuffed and fingerprinted in a courthouse. And it traumatized him. I said, Corey, if you keep fighting for what's right, and if we put the right laws and lawmakers in place, I want you to see. He said, see what, Reverend Al? I said, just watch, because in a minute, then you're going to see a whole bunch of cars pull up. And Donald Trump is going to be fingerprinted and going to be mugshot, just like you were, because we never gave up. Let's keep fighting.